Belinda Flores asked me to come and talk to you guys about the kind of work I do. I actually have never met Belinda. I've only talked to her by email, so we're like crossing paths here. I want to get a little sense of who you guys are first before I start talking. So what are you taking this class for? What program are you in? So you're all graduate students. You're all master's students in only master's students in the class? And you're in what program was it? The childhood education? Cool. And so you're towards the end of it or beginning, or everybody mixed in? Mixed in. You're 2 weeks in? 2 weeks? Oh, done in 2 weeks. Awesome. I'm sure you're happy about that. And what do you guys do, or what are you planning on doing? Why are you getting this degree?
Teacher requirement.
Teacher requirement. To do what? To advance as a teacher, or to?
To enhance our knowledge for the classroom so we can make ourselves more marketable and knowledgeable.
So are all of you teachers already?
I am.
How many? How many are you teachers already? And what grade are you teaching?
First grade.
First grade. First grade? What?
Head Start.
Oh, Head Start. So does that encompass all? No, Head Start is preschool, right? Oh, okay. So all the rest of you are preschool. So anybody teaching or planning on teaching at the elementary level beyond first grade? So like math?
Well, I think the certification standards are EC through 6 now. So I mean, I can teach all the way up to 6.
Oh, so okay. So you're trained to, even in the Head Start programs, you all are so? That's very different, isn't it? Isn't it kind of different to do preschool versus 6th grade? You got to know a lot of stuff. That's pretty diverse. And what about the rest of you? Are you all planning on going into teaching?
For a short time, but I want to get a PhD and become a professor. But I need the classroom experience.
Okay. So in this program, do you usually do a master's first before you go into the PhD, or are you just sort of like waiting? Yeah? So this is the regular progression. So just one PhD person, one PhD ambition? Soon, eventually two? Okay, awesome. And everybody's from San Antonio? Pretty much? No, you're not? Where are you from?
I'm from Marshall, Texas.
Okay, not too far. Or where is Marshall? Near Houston?
No, it's near Shreveport, Louisiana.
Oh, okay. Well, that's kind of near Houston. No, that's really it's more near Houston than this is. No. Okay, good. I just want to get a sense of who you are. So what I'm going to be telling you about, I actually the reason I'm asking you all these silly questions is because I don't do anything in the education field. My training actually was, I got a BA in psychology, and then I went on to do a master's and a PhD in cognitive neuroscience. My PhD is in cognitive science. But basically, I was interested in understanding how the brain processes language. And I'm going to be telling you about one aspect of how language can affect our cognition, our ability to do things. And so my PhD work, I was looking at native speakers of Spanish and how they process certain aspects of Spanish. I was kind of looking at how their brain uses information in a sentence. And then when I came here, I've been focused in my lab. I've been here since 2005, and my lab has focused mainly on bilingual research. So I've been looking at how the bilingual brain it understands language, and then also how the bilingual brain does other things. And that's what I'm going to tell you about today. And I think Belinda asked me to, or Dr. Flores, I don't know how you call her, but she asked me to talk to you guys about this line of work because it's probably most relevant to you guys as teachers. The questions that I basically was asking was how does being bilingual affect your ability to answer simple arithmetic problems? So if you have a child who is bilingual and can do simple arithmetic like 2 times 4 is 8, do they do that better in one language or the other? Okay, so this is a classic problem that you guys as teachers have, especially in Texas and in South Central Texas, that you have a lot of bilingual children, you have a lot of children who have different degrees of proficiency in their languages. And there's a lot of debate in the education field, from what I hear, about what's the best way of teaching kids, and what's the best way of testing them? If you have a child that's learned math in English, is it better to test them in English or better to test them in Spanish, which is their generally stronger language overall, and things like that. So one of the main questions that I'm going to tell you about today is this issue of language of learning in mathematics. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about, how many of you know about brain imaging techniques? Anybody know a little bit about brain imaging techniques? Okay, I figured as much because, you know, it's something we do over on the other side of campus. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of a background about just the technique that I use to look at people's brains. And just to preface it, I know you guys are used to thinking about children, but I'm going to be telling you about young adults, because what we do is we start doing our research in young adults. And once we figure out how the young adult brain works, then we can start asking questions in child populations. So I just wrote a grant in February that is going to be the first attempt to take this work into the elementary schools and look at young children doing simple math problems and watch their brains while they're learning math. So, but let me tell you about this. Is just mainly with young adults, undergraduates here on campus who we grab off campus, out of their classrooms. So just to give you a sort of a preface. So I'm interested in understanding how the brain handles this kind of information. So how does the bilingual brain actually take mathematical information? How is it stored, and how do we get it back out when we need it? Okay, and it's important to understand that the human brain is an incredibly fast machine. And we process, just in the context of language, we process words. Like right now you're listening to me talk at about a relatively normal rate of speech. Your brain is taking in 3 words every second. And that's really fast. You're understanding the sound, you're interpreting it for meaning, and you're putting it into a greater context so you can understand what I'm saying. And that happens really, really fast. So in order to study this very fast behavior, this very fast process in the brain, we need a technique that will allow us to record information from the body really, really quickly. And the technique that I use, I'm going to give you sort of a context. So this daunting picture is basically just a graph of all the available techniques for measuring activity in the brain. Okay, and it's just plotting it based on how much precision in the brain you can get. So how close to a single cell in the brain you can get versus looking at the whole brain. And then how quickly you can measure information. If you can measure it over an hour, or if you can measure it as quickly as milliseconds, or less than a second, half a second, I can see what's happening on a millisecond precision. So the technique that I use doesn't have very good precision in space, because we're measuring electrical activity. This is the electroencephalogram. Everybody's heard of electroencephalogram. It's like if you go to the doctor and they put an EKG on you, that little electrode they put on your heart to measure the electrical pulses of your heart. You can do the same thing with your brain. So we're walking light bulbs. We are emitting electricity at all times. Everything we do, every one of our motor cells, our muscle cells, our brain cells, they're emitting electrical charges, teeny tiny electrical charges. But if you have an electrode that is strong enough to pick up those teeny tiny charges, you can actually look for changes in activity as things are happening. And that's what they do when they measure your heart rate. When you go in for an EKG, they're looking for those changes in that electrical pulse over time. That's what those little bleeps are. So you get the same thing from your head. We just put a bunch of electrodes over your scalp, and we measure the activity of the whole brain. So we don't know where the signal is coming from exactly in the brain, but we know it's coming from the brain. Okay, so with not very good precision in terms of where things are in the head. Now there's a technique that everybody's heard about because it's always in the news, and that's fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. Everybody's heard of that. That's the one where you lay down and you go into this big, scary, giant donut, and they image you. And they use this also for medical purposes if you have to have your body scanned for any reason that doesn't show up on x-rays, soft tissue scans. And so a lot of people have heard of fMRI. fMRI is very good at giving you a picture of the inside of the brain and telling you where things are happening in the brain. But it doesn't have very good precision in time. It takes a picture of your brain really slowly, like almost on the order of a couple of seconds, so usually 6 seconds. So every 6 seconds it takes a picture. Now that sounds pretty fast, but remember I told you that you are processing 3 words per second. So if I take a picture of your brain every 6 seconds, that's 2 sentences. So how do I know what your brain's response is to a single word? So the technique that I use doesn't tell you where things are coming from, but it measures things in milliseconds, 1,000th of a second. I can take a picture of the brain every 1,000th of a second. So I can look at what your brain is doing at every point in time during that entire 2 sentences that the fMRI took a picture of. And I can tell you what's actually happening in your brain, when your brain reacts to a particular word, when it likes it, when it doesn't like it, and things like that. Okay, and I'll tell you how we know that. So I'm going to skip over these because it's too much detail. It's just the type of, if anybody's interested in the actual neuroscience of it, there's a type of neuron in the brain that just happens to be the kinds of neurons that do these processes, and they're really good for recording them outside the head. So it just is a good coincidence. So let me tell you what we do. This is the technique. I'm just going to go over this briefly in the beginning, and then we'll actually talk about the science. So this is what you do. You have somebody come into the lab, you hook them up with these little electrodes. I forgot to bring the cap. It's just a wire with a little metal disc on the end. It's very simple. And it actually just doesn't even touch your skin. It sits a little bit away from your skin and just sort of sits over your head because it's on your hair. We don't shave anybody's head or anything. And then we put this gel, it's kind of like hair gel. We put it into the little hole, and that's what touches your skin. So you make a contact between the metal disc and your skin with this gel, okay? And it's just like, it would be really bad to stick an electric cord into a swimming pool because water transmits electricity really well, right? So that's why we use this gel. It's basically a water solution, and it takes the signal from your scalp to this little metal disc. And then, so it's a passive device. It doesn't do anything to you. It's just sitting there picking up these little tiny electrical signals that are coming out of your head. Okay? And we get a continuous reading, just like that heart rate when you go to the doctor. You get this continuous reading from every one of the electrodes on your head. And what we do then is we record all the time while somebody's doing a task of some sort. So we have the person come into the lab, and they do an experiment where they have to do simple arithmetic. They have to solve simple problems like 2 times 7 is 15, correct or incorrect? Anybody? Incorrect. Okay, good. So just a simple task like that, and this is actually what they did during the experiment. They were presented with 3 numbers, and they had to say if the third number was the correct response or not for the first 2, as a multiplication of the first 2. And we record their brain activity during the entire time that they're doing that. And what we do at the same time is we have the computer is recording the brain signal, and it's telling that same computer, one computer is talking to the other. There's a computer that's showing the stimuli. It's showing the numbers, 1, 2, 3, blah, blah, blah. And it's telling the other computer, I just showed the number 15. I just showed the number 7. And it creates a time lock in the brain data. Okay? And that little timestamp then is in the data so that after we've done with the recording, we can go into the data and look for all of the times where there was a correct response and all the times where there was an incorrect response. So 2 times 7 is 15, 2 times 7 is 14. And now I can take that little piece of brain data, cut that little piece of brain data out right after you saw number 15, and I can average a bunch of those things together, a bunch of instances of when your brain's response to the correct response or the incorrect response, right? And then basically what I end up with is this little waveform of what your brain, the response that your brain had to an incorrect response. And you can compare it to the response your brain had to a correct response. Does that make sense? Does that follow? It's very simple. It's basically you're taking a piece of that brain data, and what you're looking for, the way you read this is time on the x-axis. This is 1 second of brain data. Okay, remember I told you there's a lot going on really fast. So this is 1 second of brain data. And then on this side it's microvolts, so the voltage changes. And so it's just like if your light bulb suddenly, when it goes woo, sometimes when there's like an overload of electricity, your brain is doing this essentially the same thing. And you're measuring that change in voltage. Okay? And what you're looking for is you want to see if there's a difference, if the brain recognizes a difference between the correct responses and the incorrect responses. And so you see here that the line, the dotted line, which is the incorrect response, the brain's response to incorrect responses, is different than the brain's response to the correct responses. And that indicates that at about 250 milliseconds, that's a quarter of a second, your brain realized that 15 was not the right answer to that solution. Really, really fast. Okay? So that's what we're measuring. We're measuring these very fast responses of the brain to how people process this math information. Okay, so now we know that people do this. We know that monolinguals, brains will do this. And the question is, can we use this to figure out how bilinguals are getting to information in either of their languages? Okay? So this is the premise of these experiments I'm going to tell you about. So now I'm going to basically, this is actual data from a monolingual brain, and this is the brain's response to incorrect response compared to a correct response. And so the idea here is, if I look in a bilingual's brain, and there is this idea both in the psychology literature and also in the education literature, that the language that you learned math in, you're going to use that language. No matter how good you get in the other language, you're always going to use the language that you learned math in to get to that information. Okay, so when I need to solve a problem, 2 times 7 is 15, I'm going to do it in Spanish because that's the learned language that I learned it in. Okay? So that's the assumption in the field. But what we want to do is I want to look at how the brain reacts to this information and see if that's actually correct. Okay? All right. So, all right, so just a couple of things just on the technique itself. Some of the advantages of using this technique is that you're just recording information from the brain. The person doesn't have to do anything other than pay attention to what they're supposed to do. And so this makes it a really nice technique for using with children and even with babies. So they use this technique a lot with babies who don't speak yet or that can't really do a task. And let's say that, we did a study in my lab with bilingual babies, 2-year-olds they were pre-verbal 2-year-olds, and we wanted to know if they were treating their 2 languages, Spanish and English, differently, if their brains were responding differently. And all we did was we brought them in the lab and we showed them a puppet show, and while they were watching the puppet show, we were playing Spanish and English words in the background. And we looked at how their brain responded to the Spanish and English words. The baby didn't have to do anything because their ears are not opening and closing or anything. So they're just listening to this background noise, and we measured how their brain was responding. So it's a really nice technique for sort of just understanding how the brain does things without you having to ask the person to do anything in particular. Okay. So, all right. So that's the technique that I use, and now here's the question. So if we're looking at this bilingual arithmetic, where am I? Okay, so the question here has been a sort of a philosophical question in the field and in education as well. What is the role of language in learning simple arithmetic? Okay, So Albert Einstein famously quoted that words and language do not seem to play a part in my thought process. So he was talking about how he doesn't need to think in words to do these complex mathematical thinking. So that's not the kind of arithmetic that I'm talking about. I'm talking about simple, basic arithmetic that children learn through rehearsing it verbally. 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 6 is 12. And I don't know my tables very well. So that kind of math, where you're actually learning it by memorizing it, by hearing it through words. So there's a real strong connection between the word and the concept. Okay, and this is what people refer to as exact arithmetic. Are you guys familiar with with these terms, exact arithmetic and approximate arithmetic? So the basic idea is that exact arithmetic is what I just said. 2 times 2 is 4. You know that. It's a table number. It's exact, right? 2 times 7 is closer to 15 than 10. Is not an exact fact. That's an approximation. And so the idea is that when you do approximation, when you calculate something, when you judge something like the magnitude of something, is this stick bigger than that stick? That kind of math is done by a completely different part of the brain. But when you're doing exact arithmetic and you're just sort of remembering a fact, remembering what the solution to 2 times 7 is, then you're using areas that are very related to language. You're accessing areas of the brain that are related to those words, okay? And so that's the math that I'm going to be talking about. Those concepts, mathematical concepts that are very strongly related to language. So as you guys probably already know, approximately 1 in 5 school-age children is bilingual in the U.S. And this number is estimated to grow significantly. This was a 2011 National Center for Education statistic. So this is a really important question. 1 in 5 is an incredibly high number. When you talk about like special education, and you talk about the children that have different symptoms, they're usually like 1% of the population, right? 1% of the population is a very small number relative to this. This is a significant number. I mean, if you had a disease that was 1 in 5, it would be huge. Like it would be an epidemic, right? So if you think about it in that term, being 1 in 5, that 1/5 of the population is bilingual is really significant. And becomes very significant if you think about things like the language of learning arithmetic is important, because it fundamentally changes the way you're going to educate your children, or you should educate your children, right? So it becomes really important. So what's the problem then? So we're thinking here, bilingual children, we know bilingual children can do, bilinguals in general, bilingual adults, bilingual children, you can do math. How many of you are bilingual? Many? Okay. You can do arithmetic. If I made you solve a problem in arithmetic, any of you who are bilingual, you can do it in any of your languages. The question is, can you get access to the information just as easily? Or do you have to translate? Or do you have to do something else if you're not using the language that you prefer? So the idea is from the math cognition world, is that you have this in your head, you have this memory network of information. You have these concepts in memory. And these concepts are connected. You have the word 1, you have the digit 1, and you have the translation in Spanish, uno. Okay, so you have these as separate little entries in your memory system. And that you have one of these little memory networks for each one of the formats that you know. If you speak 4 languages, then you have a memory network for each language. And the question is, how good are you at accessing this information in each one of your networks? So if you think about this as a network, there are also, not only are there number concepts, but the argument is that even this mathematical concept is an entry in memory. So 2 times 7 equals 14 is an entry in memory. You can access it as a whole, right? It's almost a trigger response. When I say 2 times 7, 14, because it's the same concept almost, right? And this concept is connected in memory to all these other concepts that are related to it. And they can be closer or further away based on how related they are. So it's very closely connected to 7 and 14 as individual numbers. It's more distantly connected to 9 because 9 is also the addition of 2 and 7. So there's all this complex relatedness amongst all of these concepts in your brain. And the idea is that when you need to access the answer 14, there's this spread of information through the network in your brain. And this activates other concepts as well a little bit. Okay? So if you have a really effective network in one language or another, if you have a really effective network, then you're going to get some activation of concepts that are distantly related. Okay? So for example, if you were really strong in English but not very strong in Spanish, then you would think that in English I could get to all of this information, but in Spanish I might only be able to get to 14 and not to any related concepts if there was some association network. Okay? Okay, so that means that you will be, by default, that means that you will be faster at saying that 2 times 7 equals, you'll be slower at saying that 2 times 7 equals 18 is an incorrect response. So 18 is not the right answer. But you'll be slower at saying that that's wrong than to say that 15 is wrong. And do you get the idea why? Because 15 is not in this association network. It's not related to that concept in any way. And this is true. This is actually what happens. So if you do a little experiment and ask people to say correct or incorrect response, and you give them all 3 possibilities, 2 times 7 is 14, 2 times 7 is 15, 2 times 7 is 18, they'll be slower. They'll say yes and no, but the times that they say no, they'll be slower at saying no to 18 than to 15. And the idea behind that is the reason why it's harder to say no to 18 is because it's slightly more related to that concept than 15. Okay? All right. So, more brain data. Oops, sorry. Is that okay? So that was a little graph that I showed you before. And this is comparing 2 conditions. So your average brain response to the correct conditions and your average brain response to the incorrect condition. Now, another way of looking at that data, if I want to say what's the effect, what's the difference between the 2 conditions, is to subtract the lines. And it's just like take the numbers point by point and you subtract the 2 lines from each other. Each point in time has a value, a specific value, like 3 volts or minus 4 volts or 2 volts. And so all you're doing is taking 2 minus 2, and where they overlap, it's going to be 0, because there's no difference between them. And where there is a difference, you're going to get some number. And so here you have, this is the difference between those 2 conditions right there. Do you see that? It's actually a very simple concept. It just looks, if you're not used to looking at it, it just looks like squiggly lines. I mean, that's what my advisor used to do. I had 2 advisors when I was a graduate student. One did behavioral work and the other did brain work. And the behavioral one was always getting annoyed. She's like, it just looks like spaghetti to me. I don't know what you're talking about. So this is the difference. Wherever this is the same as 0, which is this line right here, there's no difference between the conditions. And when this is different from 0, then there is a difference. So this is basically the effect, the brain response. We can call that the brain response to recognizing that there's an incorrect mathematical solution in the problem. Okay? And so this is what we're going to be measuring to see if bilinguals can access this information in both of their languages. If you see this brain response in both English and Spanish, then that means that they're accessing the information in both languages. If this response is smaller or goes away in one of the languages, then that means that they're not getting to that information in the same way between the 2 languages. Okay? And now, what's interesting is that this brain response in arithmetic, so in simple problems like 7 times 4 equals 26, is almost the same brain response as if I were to say something like the ball has dreamed, or I swept with a candle. Okay? It's almost the same brain response that you get when you hear a sentence that doesn't make sense. It's actually almost identical. And people think that it's actually the same type of brain process that's happening. You're trying to access something from memory that's related to this network, and when you're trying to get to the information, you're trying to understand it. So 2 times 7, you know it's 14, and then you get 15. Or I sweep with A, you're expecting broom, and you get candle. So the idea is that you're trying to access information from memory that doesn't make sense in either case. So there's some kind of general process happening in your brain that is sort of triggering this fact that, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. Okay? And what's interesting is that this little thing that happens afterwards, this dip, so that's actually negative. That's going up. That means it's a negative change. It's a minus 4 voltage change from 0. And then there's a positive shift that goes down. And that positive shift, people think, is your attempt to repair, to make sense of what didn't make sense initially. Okay, so first you get I slept with a candle, and you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense. And then you're thinking, oh, well, maybe, yeah, I guess you could sleep with a candle. You know, that kind of idea. So it's your brain's attempt to repair something that didn't make sense. Because most of the time things make sense. People don't go around saying nonsensical things. They don't go around saying, I'm going to sleep with a candle. Unless they really are going to, and then you have to sort of imagine how they're going to sleep with a candle. So there's this, you can think of the brain doing that. And this is not conscious. This is happening within half a second, okay, from the moment that you see the number. You're not aware of these things happening in your brain. When you become aware of it, it's a little bit later. So your brain is kind of way ahead of you in terms of what you're actually aware of. Okay, so what's the problem then? So if verbal learning links arithmetic to the concepts, so if whatever language I learn math in links those concepts in that memory network to that language, then that means it has two important implications. First of all, it means that language is necessary for getting to that information. Okay, so there's a strong link between the concept to and the word to. And in order for me to get to the concept to, I have to be able to access my language network to get to that concept. So that's the first implication, and that's true for anybody, whether you're bilingual or not. The second implication is that if you're bilingual, then you will be able to access that information either only in one language or selectively in one language, or better in one language than the other. And even though we're talking about simple math problems, this can have a cumulative effect. If you're slower, less efficient at getting the information in one of your languages, and you're constantly struggling to get that information, this is going to affect you in testing or in learning more generally, right? Okay. And so where does this idea come from? There's a lot of evidence in the education field. People kind of talk about it sort of as an assumption. But there are some studies that have shown that there's some sense that the language of learning is the language that people do better in, or that at least that they prefer to do math in. And this is an important distinction that I'll tell you about in a second. The fact that somebody prefers to do something in that language doesn't necessarily mean that their brain is better at doing it in that language. And I'll tell you the evidence for that in a second. But there's a famous study from Elizabeth Spelke and Sivkin where they took Russian-English bilinguals and they trained them on novel math concepts. So these are, they gave them exact arithmetic problems, like 2 times 4 is 6, but something novel, like a novel type of mathematical problem that they could memorize. Okay? And they either memorized it in English, saying it in English, or they memorized it saying it in Russian. And then they tested them afterwards. And they compared this to calculations, so estimations in English and Russian. And they showed that the bilinguals were better, much better, at getting to those concepts that they just learned in English than in Russian, or vice versa. If they learned them in Russian, they were much better at getting to those concepts in Russian than in English. Okay? But when it came to doing calculations, it didn't matter, because the calculation was not supposed to be linked to language, so they were using a different part of their brain, and it didn't matter what language they were using. So this seemed like evidence that for these exact concepts, so that you rehearse and you memorize, that you're better at getting at that information in the language in which you learned it. Okay. Then there was another study more recently that was done in the Philippines with high school students who go to they were in a bilingual education program. And these were students who had received all of their education, math education, in English. But they were L1, so first language Tagalog speakers. And they both preferred to use English and seemed to be a little bit faster at doing math problems in English, even though Tagalog was their stronger language overall. Okay, so it seems like more evidence, at least in this population, that that's the case. So, so the research I'm going to tell you about then is, if we look at the brain, if we look at that measure of the brain that I was telling you about, can we actually show evidence that that's the case? Do we actually find that people process that their brain, a bilingual's brain, processes information in the language that they learned it in better than the other language? Okay. So here's what we did. So we have our happy subject connected to the electrodes. There's a little electrode cap. And these were bilinguals. They were all L1 Spanish speakers. So it was tested here in San Antonio. So the majority of them were from birth, spoke Spanish from birth, and then either spoke English simultaneously or learned English by elementary school. And we had them sit in this room, and they just saw on the computer screen, they saw this one image at a time. They saw a period to tell them a new problem was coming. Keep touching the microphone, sorry. Then they saw the first digit, the second digit, and then a third digit. And they were told that the third digit was the solution, the multiplication solution to the first two. And they had to then make a judgment after that if it was a correct or incorrect solution. Okay? And we measured their brain activity through the entire time. But what we were really interested in looking at was their brain response to the onset of the third digit. Okay, so the moment that that digit came onto the screen, there was a marker placed in the EEG data, and then we kind of looked at what happened in the brain right after they saw the number 14. And we compared 14 to 15 as a wrong solution, and then we also compared the same problem but written in English words or written in Spanish words. Okay, so we looked at the difference between 14 and 15 as digits, as English words, or as Spanish words. And we were looking for that difference, that effect in the brain response. Okay? So what did we, so first of all, addressing the first question, this is asking the question is this is applicable to anybody? Is it necessary to go through language to get to that math concept? And so the way we did this is we were interested in looking at the timing. So time here implies that if you get this brain response earlier in time, that means your brain processed the information faster. Okay? So if this brain response is the same time for digits and words, you can't really tell if you have to go to the word to get to the digit concept. But if you can get to the digit concept first, then that means that you didn't have to go through language. Does that make sense? Maybe it'll make sense more when I show you. So I'm going to show you, this is sort of a bird's eye view of somebody's head with the electrode positions. And I'm going to show you these electrodes just to show you from top will be front of the head and bottom will be back of the head, just to give a sense of it. Okay, so here's what we found for the brain response to the digit presentations. And this is basically replicating that original finding that I showed you. If you look at the brain waves, they're very, very similar. They overlap, and then they come apart right here in this funny dip, just like that. Okay? So it basically replicates that we find this very robust effect, the brain's response to incorrect and correct solutions. And if we take the difference wave again, so remember this is just the difference of the red and the black lines. Wherever there's no difference, it's the same as 0, and then where there is a difference, you see a little hump in either negative or positive direction. And you can see again, it looks very similar to that original study with monolinguals. Okay, so this is what we found at digits. Now the question is, where's the timing relative to the response to words? Okay, so this is the brain response. Now overlapping, the black line is what I just showed you, that difference. And the red line is the same effect, but for words. All words collapse, regardless of Spanish and English. We just took all the words and we just said, are words and digits different? And what do you see? What do you notice? Digits comes first, right? So their brain responded to digits faster than it did to accessing the same information in words. So this difference is not incredibly significant. It is significant in terms of statistics, but if you think about it in terms of processing time, that's 50 milliseconds. So 50 milliseconds is really, really, really fast. You wouldn't notice it if you ask somebody to do a task or anything like that. It doesn't result in a major delay. But it tells you that the brain is able to access the information in digits faster than words, and that it's not dependent on words. Because if it were dependent on words, there is no way it could be faster than accessing the words directly, right? Because the idea is if you have to get to the word and then translate to the digit, you should be slower. And this is evidence that it's not. And this is a good sign for everybody involved, whether you're bilingual or not, especially bilinguals, because this means that even if you're slower in one of your languages, you're still as good as anybody else in digits. Yeah? And, yeah? What did I say? Yeah. Good at math. Well, I don't know what I said, but what I mean is, what did I say? I have no idea. So if you're, I don't know, I mean, in one of your languages, accessing the digit, accessing the math concepts. So that's what I meant to say. So even if I'm bilingual and I'm weaker I'm a Spanish speaker and I'm weaker in English and I'm in an English context, if I'm doing the calculations with digits, it shouldn't impair me. Do you follow? Because it's not dependent on language. Do you follow? Okay. So that's one point. Now, question number 2. So it doesn't seem like digits, when you're processing in digits, that you have to access that language information to get to it. So the second question now is that language of learning really important? Now we're going to look at comparing the two languages to each other, the brain response to the two languages to each other. So here was the response to the digits. This is the one I just showed you. In the red is the incongruent condition compared to the congruent. And now I'm going to split it up now into the language of learning. And note that in this population, they might have learned it in English or they might have learned it in Spanish. So we collapsed across whether they learned it in English or Spanish and just called it the language of learning. Okay? Does that follow me? All right. So some people, let's just give the example so that you understand who these people are. Let's say that they're Spanish speakers spoke Spanish at home and entered the school system in kindergarten or in Head Start. And some of them might have entered a bilingual education program so that they're getting all of their information tailored, Spanish, and then slowly get more English. And some of them might have been thrown into an English environment. So these are the kind of people we're talking about. Some of them might have learned math from the beginning in English, and some of them might have learned it in Spanish. Okay? All right, so here's the response to the language of learning. Very similar. It has a little bit of different shape. Nice, big, robust response with this later positivity. And here's the response to the other language. And from here, they don't look a whole lot different, right? So now what I'm going to do, I'm going to take the subtraction again, and I'm going to compare the subtraction of the two to see if they're any different. And what we expect, based on the theory, is that this one should be a bigger difference, at least, than this one. So this one is definitely not absent. They're definitely able to access the information pretty well. Now the question is, are they different at all? And the answer is no. This is a population, this is an average of almost 40 individual people. And so when you look at the group, when you look at the people as a group, there is no difference between their two languages. It seems like this idea that the language of learning is the language that you need to use to access the math information, bless you, does not seem to be the case. Well, this is a little bit surprising. We thought, well, maybe it's just such a simple task. 2 times 4 is 8. Such a simple task that they're just maxed out. They just can't do any better, and that's why you don't see a difference between the languages. That didn't seem to be the case. There was a significant difference. They were pretty accurate overall, but there was some differences between the congruent and the incongruent. They were significantly slower at the incongruent trials. In this one, but they were pretty highly accurate. But if that were the case, if this is what it is, if it's just a ceiling effect, then you wouldn't expect to see any difference across any. If you took any individual and looked at them, then their two languages should be the same. So the question is now, does this look the same if you look at every single person? Okay, so this is a group of 40 people. Now, if I look at each one of those 40 people individually, do their two waveforms look the same, or is there a variability in the group that averages together to look like this? And so when we looked at that, now bear with me for a moment. These are all the individual subjects. Actually, this is just an example of 26 subjects, but there were more in there. These are all the individual subjects on this line. The blue dot is basically a representation of that effect, that difference. So this little difference right here, this has a numerical value. So the height of this is like 2 microvolts. Okay, so it's just that number. that I'm showing you in this graph. And so I'm showing you the blue dot is the language of learning for each individual, and the green dot is the other language for each individual. And if you see, there are some people have a big difference where the language of learning and lower in this case is a bigger effect, because the solid line is 0 and this is more negative. Okay, it's upside down from what you're looking at the ERPs. But basically, if it's lower, it's a bigger effect in the brain waves. Okay, so you can see here that there's a much bigger effect in the language of learning than in the other language for this individual. But there are some people that have no difference between their two languages, and there's some people who have a big difference in the opposite direction. Okay, so it turns out that average, that no difference between the languages, is if you look at the entire population. But if you look individual by individual, it varies incredibly. So it varies from one person to the next whether they prefer one language or the other. Well, what might be driving these individual differences? Okay, this is not the answer people want to know, right? Because it makes everything more complicated. You'd like to just say, this is the language you should use. But as you guys know, that's never the case in education. Okay, one more difference of differences of differences. This is taking the blue line minus the green line. Okay? So this is just to look at the difference between the languages. So now this just basically represents if you're below 0, that means that you are better in the language of learning. If you're above 0, it means you are better in the other language. It's just a different representation of what I just showed you. And you can see this incredible linear progression. There's every possible combination in the book in this population. So there isn't even a grouping of people. You can't even say that there's this kind of person and this kind of person. It's just every possibility is there. All right. So we try to figure out what could be causing this. Maybe they're stronger in one language than the other. Maybe it has something to do with that. So we looked at their language dominance, and it turns out that everybody was dominant in their language of learning, except for those yellow dots, which were dominant in their L2. And you can see they're spread out all over the place. You might have expected them to be on one side. They were dominant in that language, but they're not. It's spread out. It has nothing to do with it. Then we looked at a measure of what is this one? Is dominance in their L2. The next one is a different measure of language proficiency. And what this is the Boston naming test. I don't know if anybody has heard of the Boston naming test before. It's a measure they use in aphasia populations when you get a stroke. It's a set of pictures. It's a set of 60 pictures that you have to name, and it starts with really easy pictures, like easy things to name, like a pencil and a bed, and it goes to really hard things like an abacus and a thing that you put on horses that I can't remember the name for right now. That's why I said, huh? Do I? Somebody said it. The thing that you put on the anyway, it doesn't matter. It's something that's really hard to name, and that's the point. If you can name all 60 words, then you don't have a problem. And they basically sort of determine people's deficiency in naming ability based on the number of pictures that they can name. Anyway, in a normal population, people can name pretty much all the pictures except for those couple of the one at the end that I don't have a trouble with too. And so 56 to 60 is a normal average person. Okay, so we did this test in both of their languages sort of as a measure of how good they are in each language. And then we compared, so this is a subtraction, and basically what this shows is the red dots that are on below 0 means that you're better in your language of learning, and the red dots that are above 0 means that you're better in the other language. And again, there's no relationship. The dots are all over the place. We could not figure out what was driving this difference, this individual differences across the population. So we thought that maybe this has had to do with individual experience. Every bilingual has a unique history in how they've used their languages, right? And they have, some bilinguals use both of their languages in different ways, even in the current moment. Okay? So we thought, well, how can we test this? How can we test this in a population that we can get access to? And so we turned to you guys, who are, or at least to those of you who are going to become bilingual teachers, we looked at elementary school teachers who were themselves bilingual, not necessarily teaching in a bilingual environment, but people who were themselves bilingual and who were teaching math concepts. And the idea here was that if you learned math in, let's say, Spanish, and you're now teaching it in English, that maybe you could relearn the concepts in English, and so you can become even better in English than in your original language of learning. But if you if you learned it in Spanish and are still teaching in Spanish, then that language should be much better than the other language. Okay, so we thought, well, this is a natural environment situation where we can actually kind of look at how experience at the moment in time for a bilingual affects their ability to get access to the information. So we did the exact same task. We did 14 teachers. They were all, language of learning was always their first language. And they were all elementary school teachers and very good at doing this math task, by the way, which is a sign that there are experts at arithmetic in this case. Okay, so we did exactly the same task. We measured the same point in time, and this is what we got. So if we looked at, there was absolutely no difference between the two languages again. But what we did find was, again, a difference in timing. And you can see it best on the top electrode over there. The black line is, we couldn't find any difference based on their language of learning. The only difference we found was based on the language in which they were teaching. And half of them were teaching in the language that they learned the information, half of them were teaching it in the other language. And it turns out that regardless of which language they learned it in, whichever language they were teaching in, they were faster at getting to the information. They were faster at getting to the math concepts in whatever language they were teaching in. So this means that experience really has a really important role in how you get to that information. So it doesn't matter what your background was. If you're using those concepts right now in one of your two languages, you're going to be better at getting to that information in that language. Okay, so this is bilingual teachers. And now the flip side is looking at the bilingual children and trying to see what's happening on the learning when you're actually learning, you're bilingual and you're learning these concepts for the first time. So in conclusion for this data set, we found that digits were about 50 milliseconds faster. The brain responded 50 milliseconds faster to digits than words, which means that you don't need to access words to get to your digits information. Okay, so it's a good sign for most people. And we also found that these were bilinguals who were relatively balanced in their languages. There is no effect of language of learning. So the language of learning is not what dictates how well you will do in math. Oh, and another interesting thing I forgot to mention is that almost every single person said that they would do better in their language of learning. They all preferred their language of learning, and yet half of the people did better in the other language. So their sort of subjective sense of how well they do in one language or the other is not a very good indicator of how their brain processes the information. We couldn't explain these individual differences, but it appears that, at least from the bilingual educators' data, that this is probably to a large degree driven by individual experience. And so we want to do some studies in the future. There's the grant that I just wrote, and the reason I actually met Dr. Flores is because the grant that I wrote, I want to start looking at children. And I actually want to start looking at two different populations that I think will be an interesting contrast. I want to look at young children who are themselves bilingual and are learning math in one language. And the idea is that they have the languages in place, but they're learning the math concepts for the first time. And we want to test to see how quickly they get to that information in either of the languages. If during the learning process you're sort of establishing those original memory networks in that one language, then it should be really, there should be a huge difference between the languages. So the brain should have this established memory network for the concepts in the language that they're learning, and not in the other. That's the question, because if you get it automatically with both languages, and there's a lot of evidence in the bilingual literature that even if you're trying to only use one language, you're always activating the other language. And so there may be a default process that you're actually spreading this information to the other language, whether you want to or not. And so the question will be, in these young children who are learning math for the first time, do they have access to the information in one language, or can they get to it in both languages from the beginning, even if they're only learning it in one? So that's one question. And then I want to ask the flip side. Now you have somebody who has those math concepts established. The memory networks are established in one language. Adult monolinguals. They've learned math concepts when they were a kid. They have it in one language, and now they're learning a second language. And the question is, how quickly can they get to that information? How quickly are they able, in the learning process, in the developmental trajectory, are they able to access that information if they're being tested in the language that they're learning? Okay, so it's kind of two sides to the same question. In one condition, in one population, you already have the languages established and you're learning the concepts. In the other one, you have the concepts established and you're learning the language. And how quickly does that information spread to the other language? And then some other things as well. So that's the end of that. Do you have any questions on the experiments? Or in the data, or anything about the findings? So since you guys are in the classrooms, especially the first grades, I don't know how many people have experience beyond first grade, or I mean, you've learned about it anyway. Do the bilingual children that are in San Antonio, so if we were to go to like Bonham Elementary. It's one of the, I think this Bonham Elementary is one of the ones that is closely linked with the programs at UTSA, or no, Bonham, well, SAISD schools. Are the kids, by the time they're learning arithmetic concepts, do you guys know if they are fluent in both languages? Do most of them master both English and Spanish? Or will there be a lot of diversity in how well they speak the two languages? Do you have any idea?
Well, I know at my school,
Where are you?
I teach at CC Ball, which is also SAISD.
Mm-hmm.
In first grade, in fact, we just had to split the bilingual class because the substitute didn't show up. And I had 5 extra kids. 3 of them were fluent in English and Spanish, and 2 of them weren't. And I felt really bad because I don't speak any Spanish. For the 2 that were in there, it was a wasted day for them because I'm not sure if they really understood anything that was going on in the class. So I think it just kind of depends on the kids.
So there may be a lot of variability.
Yeah.
And what age is that? What?
First grade, so it's
That's
6
first.
and 7.
So they're getting arithmetic by 3rd grade, right? Is it in 3rd grade? I don't remember my 3rd grade education. Multiplication, 3rd grade? Yeah, 3rd, 4th? 3rd, 4th. So it would be around that time. So I'm wondering if by that time there's a significant population of fluent bilingual children, like that they're actually fluent in both languages, and not that they're struggling in one language or the other. I wonder if that's...
Would that also depend on if the kids are in a dual language program? They
Yeah.
get instruction in English, and then the other half of the day they get instruction in Spanish?
Yeah, and there's a lot of there's variability in the programs, whether it's dual or immersion or bilingual education, and but what I understand is that most of the programs, regardless of what kind of program it is, that math is taught in English here. Is that true? Is that true? So I was actually thinking for this initial population. So my next grant that I write, what I'd really like to do is figure out how these different programs affect learning these concepts, whether you're in a bilingual immersion or if you're an ESL program or a bilingual or dual program. Yeah.
I was in a transitional program.
Uh-huh.
And they start you off in your native language, which is Spanish.
Uh-huh.
And I did my math in pre-kinder, and it was in Spanish. So when they transition us later on to the mainstream and monolingual class, I already had the concept. So
Yeah, the concept, but it was learned in a different language.
and you're connecting.
But you had learned it in Spanish, and then you had to now switch to English to use it in the classroom. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have your foundation in Spanish.
Mhm.
And then you get the transition into English.
Mhm.
So when the concept is there, you have the grades. I mean, it's really there.
Uh-huh. So there's some research by a group out in San Diego, in California, Northern California somewhere. But they were actually arguing that children who do that, who transition to another language from having learned it in one language and now have to use it in another language, that they actively translate the information. So depending on how long they have learned those concepts in one language or the other. So they were usually looking at immigrant children who had come over in the middle of elementary school or something. And so these are children who really had a strong foundation in one language and not the other. And they found that in the classroom, if they had like group solving problem sessions, the kids would talk to each other in Spanish and then translate the concepts and answer in English to the teachers. And so they were sort of thinking in Spanish, but translating it to English to give the answers. So there seems to be, it depends a lot on the strength of the language and strength of those concepts, it seems like. But this is really interesting though, because in education, there seems to be, in the education research, there seems to be a lot of discussion about the importance of language in the classroom and which language they're using to teach these concepts. But in the math cognition world, if you like jump over just to talk to psychologists who are just studying people in the laboratory, they argue that language has nothing to do with anything, that it doesn't matter, that math is independent. Math cognition is independent of language. And so what we're showing here through these bilingual individuals is that it does matter, and it matters differently depending on your experiences, which makes it really hard because there's no simple answer. There's no silver bullet to solving the problem of having bilingual children in your classroom. But it makes a reality of this. So those studies that I mentioned at the beginning that basically said, well, the language of learning is always the one that matters. So they must have been they were looking at the whole population. They didn't look at the individuals to see that, yeah, they average together, but when you look at individuals, they're doing all kinds of stuff. And so our study really is important in that way because it's the first one to really say, look, it's not that simple. You have to take into account individual variability. Especially when you're trying to infer from this how to educate children in the classroom. So that's what we've done so far. And you guys are more than welcome to come by any time to our lab to see the facility, to see how we record data. We do a lot of other studies too. We're also looking, like I told you, at language, just general language processing. And other fun things.